Stage 1. The suffocating weight of their own isolation. The first stage begins when the avoidant's carefully constructed emotional fortress starts feeling less like protection and more like a prison. Their nervous system, once content in its isolated state, begins sending distress signals that penetrate through their layers of psychological defense. The silence that once felt peaceful transforms into a deafening reminder of their disconnection from authentic human experience. Their mind, accustomed to rationalizing away emotional needs, struggles to maintain its usual convincing arguments against connection. The cognitive mechanisms that once effortlessly dismissed the importance of relationships begin to falter under the weight of accumulated loneliness. They find themselves unable to generate the same enthusiasm for their solitary existence that previously sustained them through periods of isolation. The physiological manifestations of their isolation become impossible to ignore as their body begins rebelling against the emotional starvation they have imposed. Sleep patterns become disrupted by an inexplicable restlessness that no amount of logical analysis can resolve. Their nervous system experiences chronic low-level anxiety that seems to emanate from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Their emotional regulation systems, calibrated for decades to maintain equilibrium through detachment, begin malfunctioning in subtle but persistent ways. The avoidant discovers that activities that once brought satisfaction now feel hollow and meaningless. Their carefully cultivated interests and hobbies fail to provide the same sense of fulfillment, leaving them with a growing awareness of something essential missing from their existence. The psychological architecture of their identity begins showing stress fractures as they confront the reality that their self-sufficiency might actually be self-imposed suffering. Their sense of strength and independence, once sources of pride, start feeling like elaborate facades concealing a profound emptiness that they can no longer deny or rationalize away. Their mind begins generating intrusive thoughts about past relationships and connections they terminated or avoided. These mental intrusions feel foreign and unwelcome, yet they persist with increasing frequency and intensity. The avoidant finds themselves remembering conversations, shared moments, and emotional exchanges with a clarity that surprises and disturbs them. The suffocating nature of their isolation manifests as a physical sensation of constriction around their chest and throat. They experience difficulty breathing deeply, as if their emotional walls have become physical barriers, preventing the free flow of air and energy through their body. This somatic awareness forces them to acknowledge that their psychological state has tangible physical consequences. Their sleep becomes populated with dreams that reveal their suppressed longings for connection and intimacy. Upon waking, they experience moments of disorientation where the warmth and closeness from their dreams feels more real than their actual isolated existence. These dream experiences create cognitive dissonance that challenges their conscious beliefs about their preference for solitude. The avoidant begins experiencing unexpected moments of overwhelming sadness that seem to arise from nowhere. These emotional eruptions feel alien and threatening, yet they persist despite their attempts to suppress or rationalize them. Their usual emotional numbing techniques prove inadequate against the intensity of feelings that seem to be breaking through their defensive barriers. Their relationship with time becomes distorted as hours feel endless, while simultaneously seeming to slip away without meaning or significance. The avoidant realizes that their days blend together in a monotonous cycle, devoid of the emotional markers that typically give time structure and meaning. This temporal disorientation contributes to a growing sense of existential emptiness that they struggle to address through their usual coping mechanisms. The recognition that their isolation has become suffocating rather than protective creates the first crack in their defensive armor. Their nervous system begins signaling that something fundamental must change, though they remain unclear about what that change might involve or whether they have the courage to pursue it. Stage 2. The haunting presence of specific memories. The second stage emerges as the avoidant's mind becomes increasingly occupied with memories of a specific person or relationship that they previously dismissed or devalued. These recollections surface with startling vividness and emotional intensity, forcing them to confront the depth of connection they actually experienced before their defensive mechanisms kicked in to destroy it. Their nervous system responds to these emerging memories with a complex mixture of warmth and panic. The avoidant experiences physiological reactions to their recollections, increased heart rate, changes in breathing patterns, and unexpected tears that reveal the emotional significance of connections they thought they had successfully minimized or forgotten. The psychological impact of these haunting memories creates severe cognitive dissonance as the avoidant struggles to reconcile their current loneliness with their previous dismissal of the very relationship they now find themselves missing. Their mind engages in elaborate mental gymnastics, attempting to maintain their self-concept while acknowledging the growing evidence that they may have made a terrible mistake. Their sleep becomes dominated by dreams featuring the specific person they are remembering. These nocturnal experiences range from tender reconnection scenarios to anxiety-inducing confrontations, reflecting the internal conflict between their longing for connection and their terror of vulnerability. They wake with emotional residue from these dreams that lingers throughout their waking hours. The avoidant begins reinterpreting past interactions through a new lens, recognizing signs of genuine care and affection that they previously ignored, minimized, or mischaracterized. This reanalysis of their relationship history creates waves of regret and self-recrimination as they realize how their defensive patterns may have damaged something valuable and irreplaceable. Their emotional regulation systems become overwhelmed by the intensity of feelings associated with these specific memories. The avoidant discovers that their usual techniques for emotional suppression are ineffective against memories that seem to carry their own emotional charge, independent of their conscious will or desire to remain detached. The physical manifestations of memory-induced longing begin affecting their daily functioning. They experience chest tightness when certain memories surface, feel weakness in their limbs when recalling moments of tenderness, and notice changes in their appetite and energy levels that correlate with the emotional intensity of their recollections. Their mind begins creating elaborate fantasies about reconnection and reconciliation that feel more vivid and compelling than their actual daily experiences. These mental scenarios become increasingly detailed and frequent, serving as both comfort and torture as they provide imaginary relief from loneliness while highlighting the reality of their current isolation. The avoidant starts noticing environmental triggers that evoke memories of their lost connection, songs, locations, foods, or activities that remind them of shared experiences. These triggers create unpredictable emotional responses that catch them off guard and force them to acknowledge the depth of their suppressed attachment to this specific person. Their nervous system begins responding to memory triggers with activation patterns similar to those experienced during actual relationship interactions. The avoidant realizes that their body remembers the connection even when their mind tried to dismiss or forget it, creating physiological evidence of attachment that they cannot rationalize away. The haunting quality of these memories stems from their recognition that they may have lost something irreplaceable through their own defensive actions. This realization creates a form of self-induced grief that is particularly painful because they understand their own role in creating their current suffering. Their cognitive processes become increasingly dominated by memories of this specific person, making it difficult to concentrate on work, daily activities, or other relationships. The avoidant discovers that their mental energy is being consumed by constant processing and reprocessing of past interactions, analyzing what went wrong and imagining what could have been different. Stage 3. The desperate internal bargaining and rationalization. The third stage manifests as an intense period of internal negotiation where the avoidant's mind attempts to find ways to justify reconnection while maintaining their defensive self-concept. Their psychological system engages in elaborate mental gymnastics, creating complex rationales that would allow them to reach out without admitting their fundamental need for connection or acknowledging their previous mistakes. Their nervous system experiences heightened anxiety during this stage as they wrestle with competing drives for connection and self-protection. The physiological stress of internal conflict manifests as tension headaches, muscle tightness, and digestive disturbances that reflect the intensity of their psychological struggle between desire and fear. The cognitive mechanisms involved in this bargaining process become increasingly sophisticated as the avoidant attempts to construct scenarios for reconnection that preserve their ego and minimize their vulnerability. They create elaborate justifications based on practical concerns, mutual interests, or external circumstances that would provide cover for their actual emotional motivations. Their mind generates countless hypothetical approaches to reconnection, rehearsing conversations, messages, and encounters with obsessive detail. These mental rehearsals become compulsive, as the avoidant attempts to find the perfect approach that would guarantee a positive response, while revealing nothing about their own emotional neediness or desperation. The internal bargaining extends to negotiations with themselves about the level of vulnerability they would be willing to risk. The avoidant creates complex internal contracts that specify exactly how much emotion they would be willing to express, how much need they would acknowledge, and what protections they would maintain even within a reconnection attempt. Their psychological defenses work overtime during this stage, generating increasingly creative explanations for why reconnection might be beneficial, practical, or even noble. The avoidant convinces themselves that they are motivated by concern for the other person, shared responsibilities, or external circumstances rather than acknowledging their own desperate need for connection. The rationalization process involves selective memory editing, where the avoidant minimizes their own role in the relationship's destruction while emphasizing the positive aspects of their past connection. They construct narratives that position them as the victim of misunderstandings rather than the architect of emotional distance and rejection. Their nervous system experiences periods of excitement and hope, alternating with crashes of despair and self-doubt as they cycle through different rationalization schemes. The avoidant discovers that each mental justification for reconnection ultimately requires acknowledging vulnerabilities they are not yet ready to face, leading to renewed attempts at finding perfect solutions. The internal bargaining becomes increasingly frantic as the avoidant realizes that no amount of mental gymnastics can eliminate the fundamental requirement for vulnerability and risk inherent in any genuine attempt at reconnection. This recognition creates psychological pressure that builds toward either breakthrough or breakdown. Their sleep becomes fitful as their subconscious mind continues the bargaining process even during rest. The avoidant experiences dreams where they successfully reconnect through various elaborate schemes, only to wake to the reality that these perfect scenarios exist only in their imagination. The desperate quality of this internal negotiation reflects their growing awareness that they may be running out of time to repair the damage they have caused. The avoidant begins experiencing urgency that competes with their need for perfect solutions, creating internal pressure that becomes increasingly difficult to manage through their usual coping mechanisms. Their emotional regulation systems become strained by the constant internal conflict between their desire for connection and their need to maintain their defensive identity. The avoidant discovers that the psychological energy required to maintain this internal bargaining process is exhausting and unsustainable, yet they cannot seem to stop the cycle or move forward with actual action. Stage 4. The tentative and heavily defended approach. The fourth stage begins when the avoidant finally takes concrete action toward reconnection, though their approach remains heavily protected by defensive mechanisms designed to minimize vulnerability and preserve escape routes. Their initial contact attempts are typically indirect, ambiguous, and carefully constructed to test the waters while revealing nothing about their actual emotional state or motivations. Their nervous system experiences intense activation during this stage, with fight or flight responses triggering at the mere thought of making contact. The physiological stress of reaching out manifests as sweating, trembling, rapid heartbeat, and shallow breathing that reflect the magnitude of risk they perceive in taking this step toward connection. The psychological preparation for initial contact involves elaborate planning and contingency development that rivals military operations in their complexity and thoroughness. The avoidant creates detailed scripts for various response scenarios, prepares explanations for their absence, and develops multiple backup plans for retreat if their overtures are not well received. Their communication attempts are masterpieces of emotional camouflage, designed to convey interest while revealing nothing vulnerable or authentic. The avoidant crafts messages that could be interpreted in multiple ways, allowing them to claim casual intent if their advance is rejected, while leaving room for deeper interpretation if it is welcomed. The defensive nature of their approach extends to timing and method selection, with the avoidant choosing communication channels and moments that provide maximum control and minimum risk. They may reach out through mutual friends, social media platforms, or professional contexts that offer built-in explanations for contact that have nothing to do with personal feelings or needs. Their nervous system remains hypervigilant throughout this process, monitoring for any signs of rejection, judgment, or emotional demand that might trigger their defensive withdrawal. The avoidant experiences each moment of waiting for a response as potential confirmation of their worst fears about vulnerability and rejection. The psychological impact of taking action creates cognitive dissonance, as their behavior contradicts their self-concept as someone who doesn't need others. The avoidant must perform complex mental gymnastics to reconcile their reaching out with their identity as an independent individual, often creating elaborate justifications that minimize the significance of their actions. Their emotional regulation during this stage involves careful monitoring and suppression of any signs of eagerness, desperation, or authentic feeling that might slip through their defensive barriers. The avoidant maintains rigid control over their emotional expression, presenting a facade of casual interest while internally experiencing intense anxiety and hope. The tentative quality of their approach reflects their ongoing ambivalence about connection and their readiness to retreat at the first sign of discomfort or demand for genuine vulnerability. The avoidant positions themselves psychologically for quick withdrawal, maintaining emotional distance even while attempting to decrease physical or communicative distance. Their sleep patterns during this period become dominated by anxiety dreams about rejection, exposure, and loss of control. The avoidant experiences nightmares where their overtures are met with ridicule, anger, or indifference, while also having dreams of successful reconnection that leave them feeling exposed and vulnerable upon waking. The heavily defended nature of their approach often creates communication that feels stilted, formal, or emotionally distant even when attempting connection. The avoidance protective mechanisms interfere with their ability to convey genuine warmth or interest, potentially sabotaging their reconnection attempts through the very defenses designed to protect them. Their nervous system remains in a state of chronic stress throughout this stage as they navigate the competing demands of reaching out while staying protected. The physiological strain of maintaining this level of defensive vigilance while attempting connection creates exhaustion that affects their ability to think clearly or respond authentically to any responses they receive. Stage 5. The fragile dance of conditional re-engagement. The final stage occurs when the avoidant receives a positive response to their overtures and must navigate the complex process of re-establishing connection while managing their overwhelming terror of vulnerability and potential re-abandonment. This stage represents the most psychologically challenging phase as they attempt to balance their desperate need for reconnection with their ingrained patterns of self-protection and emotional withdrawal. Their nervous system experiences extreme dysregulation during this stage, alternating between euphoric relief at successful contact and paralyzing anxiety about the implications of renewed connection. The physiological responses include racing heart, sweating, trembling, and digestive disturbances that reflect the magnitude of emotional risk they are undertaking. The psychological complexity of re-engagement involves constant internal negotiations about how much vulnerability to risk, how much emotion to reveal, and how quickly to allow intimacy to develop. The avoidant experiences each interaction as a carefully calculated exposure of self that must be precisely calibrated to maintain safety while allowing connection to grow. Their emotional regulation systems become overwhelmed by the intensity of feelings that accompany successful reconnection, combined with their terror of losing control or being hurt again. The avoidant discovers that their usual coping mechanisms are inadequate for managing the emotional complexity of renewed relationship while maintaining their defensive stance. The conditional nature of their re-engagement manifests as constant testing behaviors designed to ensure their safety and the other person's genuine interest while simultaneously pushing the limits of what the relationship can tolerate. The avoidant creates elaborate tests of loyalty, patience, and commitment that often sabotage the very connection they are desperate to rebuild. Their mind becomes hypervigilant for any signs of rejection, criticism, or emotional demands that might trigger their defensive withdrawal. Every conversation, interaction, and response is analyzed for hidden meanings, potential threats, or evidence that their vulnerability is being exploited or their trust is misplaced. The fragile quality of this stage stems from their awareness that they are operating outside their comfort zone without adequate emotional skills or relationship experience to navigate genuine intimacy successfully. The avoidant feels simultaneously desperate to maintain the connection and terrified that they will destroy it through their own defensive patterns. Their communication during re-engagement remains carefully controlled and strategically ambiguous, revealing just enough authentic feeling to maintain the other person's interest while preserving multiple escape routes and face-saving explanations if the relationship fails again. This creates interactions that feel simultaneously intimate and distant. The psychological strain of maintaining this delicate balance between connection and protection creates chronic stress that manifests as anxiety, insomnia, and emotional volatility. The avoidant experiences mood swings that alternate between hope and despair, often within the same conversation or interaction. Their nervous system interprets the vulnerability required for sustained re-engagement as an ongoing threat, maintaining high levels of stress hormones that create physical symptoms including headaches, muscle tension, and immune system suppression. The physiological cost of attempting intimacy while maintaining defenses becomes increasingly apparent. The dance-like quality of their re-engagement involves constant adjustment of emotional distance based on their perception of safety and threat. The avoidant moves closer when they feel secure and retreats when they feel exposed, creating a pattern of approach and avoidance that can be confusing and frustrating for their reconnection partner. Their sleep becomes dominated by dreams that reflect their internal conflict between desire for connection and fear of engulfment or abandonment. These dreams often involve scenarios where they are simultaneously pursuing and fleeing from the same person, reflecting their fundamental ambivalence about intimate connection. The conditional aspect of their re-engagement means that their willingness to continue developing the relationship depends on maintaining strict control over the pace, depth, and terms of intimacy. The avoidant requires constant reassurance that they can withdraw without consequences, while simultaneously needing proof that the other person will not abandon them. Their emotional experience during this stage includes moments of genuine joy and connection alternating with periods of panic and regret about their vulnerability. The avoidant discovers that the very connection they craved creates new anxieties and challenges that they are not sure they have the emotional resources to handle successfully. The fragility of this final stage reflects their understanding that they are attempting something that goes against their fundamental psychological programming while lacking the emotional skills and relationship experience necessary for sustained intimate connection. This creates a situation where success requires not just courage but also significant personal growth and change that they may not be ready or able to undertake. What to do when they come back? When the avoidant finally makes their tentative approach after progressing through these 5 grueling stages, their return creates a complex psychological minefield that requires careful navigation. The person receiving their overtures must understand that they are dealing with someone whose nervous system is in a state of extreme dysregulation, simultaneously desperate for connection and terrified of the vulnerability it requires. The initial response to their return must strike a delicate balance between welcoming their courage in reaching out while maintaining firm boundaries that protect against future emotional whiplash. Their nervous system needs to encounter predictable, consistent responses that do not trigger their hypervigilant threat detection systems or activate their defensive withdrawal mechanisms. Understanding the psychology behind their return is crucial for anyone considering re-engagement with a returning avoidant. Their approach represents months or years of internal struggle, accumulated loneliness, and desperate bargaining with themselves about whether reconnection is worth the risk. This recognition should inform the response strategy, acknowledging both their courage and their fragility. The emotional regulation required when they return involves managing one's own activated attachment system while not overwhelming the avoidant's limited capacity for emotional intensity. Their nervous system can only handle small doses of intimacy and vulnerability before becoming flooded and triggering their defensive responses. Pacing becomes essential for successful re-engagement. Setting clear expectations about communication patterns, emotional availability, and relationship progression helps create the predictable framework that the avoidance nervous system needs to feel safe enough to remain engaged. Their psychology requires knowing what to expect and having control over the pace and intensity of reconnection to prevent overwhelming their limited emotional resources. The psychological work required involves helping them understand that genuine connection requires sustained vulnerability rather than the conditional engagement they typically offer. This educational process must be gentle and patient, recognizing that decades of defensive programming cannot be undone quickly or easily through willpower alone. Maintaining one's own emotional stability becomes paramount when dealing with a returning avoidant whose capacity for consistent emotional presence remains limited. Their psychology involves testing behaviors, withdrawal patterns, and defensive reactions that can trigger abandonment fears and anxious responses in their partners if not properly understood and managed. The decision of whether to engage with their return ultimately depends on one's own capacity for patience, understanding, and emotional regulation while maintaining healthy boundaries. Their psychology requires partners who can remain stable and consistent even when faced with their inevitable testing behaviors and defensive withdrawals that will continue throughout the reconnection process. Understanding that their return does not guarantee change helps maintain realistic expectations about what reconnection might involve. Their nervous system and psychological patterns have been decades in the making and will not transform simply because they have recognized their need for connection. Sustainable change requires professional support, personal commitment, and time that they may not be willing or able to invest. The ultimate recognition involves understanding that their return represents both an opportunity and a risk that must be carefully evaluated against one's own emotional needs and capacity for navigating the complex psychology of avoidant attachment patterns.